Olá, sou a Mariana Alvim, bem-vindos ao Vale a Pena, o meu podcast onde conhecemos as pessoas enquanto leitores, com o apoio da WUC, a maior livraria online portuguesa. Fiquem por aí, vale a pena. It is with great happiness that we're having me and my listeners, Jeanine Cummins, at our podcast, Vale a Pena. You know, it's called Vale a Pena. It means like it's worth it.
Yes.
And also pena means feather, with which you write.
Yes.
So it's like playing with the name.
Oh, very good.
But it's worth it.
Yes.
You're an author of a memoir, A Rip in Heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Do you say rip or R-I-P?
Rip.
Rip.
Yes.
A Rip in Heaven. And 3 novels, The Outside Boy, The Crooked Branch, and of course, American Dirt, Terra Americana, the only one translated, but I hope the others will be too, for those who don't read in English.
Yes.
So A Rip in Heaven, it's a memoir, a sad memoir.
Yes, a really tragic memoir. It was my first book, and it's a story of a true story of a horrible true crime that happened in my family when I was a teenager, when I was 16. It's a story of a double murder in my family. 2 of my cousins were murdered, and my brother was the only surviving victim of the crime. So that book tells the story not only of what it was to endure losing 2 of our loved ones in that violent way, but also what my brother suffered in the aftermath of the crime.
It was hard for sure to write that book. Did it help in any way? How did your brother respond to it?
Yes, actually, it was my brother's idea.
Wow.
So he approached me first, and I was in my early 20s at the time. He was a firefighter, and his therapist had said to him, you really should write down your story. And he had tried, and he's not a writer. He couldn't do it. So he came to me and he said, will you help me write my story? And at first I was like, no thanks, because it was so painful, and I didn't want to, there was a lot that I didn't want to know about that night. I didn't want to go into the details and sear them into my memory. But I think what I didn't know before I wrote the book was that I was living in those details anyway. And
it's the aftermath forever.
That's right, yeah. It's such a formative time in your life. I was 16, and I was close with my cousins, and we had dinner with them just a few hours before they were murdered.
But you weren't there, were you? Because I saw in the place that you weren't there, and then in the other story, you were there.
Oh, I wasn't on the bridge where they were attacked. Yeah. I was in the city. We were there on vacation, and I had the option of going with them that night, and I stayed home. So, you live with that kind of guilt for many years, and I think I didn't know any difference, so it didn't occur to me that the way I was living was strange, that I thought of them and what had happened to them. I thought about it every hour of every day.
Why guilt?
Because I survived. Because I survived and they didn't, and my brother survived and they didn't, and our family was intact, and we were able to continue growing and becoming adults and finding our lives, and they didn't have that opportunity. So there was a tremendous amount of guilt attached to that, and I didn't realize how heavily I was dwelling on that experience until I wrote the book. And I think writing it was very cathartic for me. It allowed me to sort of process a lot of what was stuck in my psychology. And I still think of them very often, but it's no longer a lodge in my heart and my throat that stays there unmovable every single day. I feel as though writing the book allowed me to move through it a bit.
Great. A Rip in Heaven. You wrote it in 2004. Then in 2010, you wrote The Outside Boy.
Yes.
This is fiction.
Yes.
Your first fiction book.
Yes, my first novel. And it's funny, my editor at the time, I remember her saying to me, you really couldn't go further from the real, the memoir, the nonfiction book. Suddenly I was writing about Irish gypsies in the 1950s, a young boy.
Roaming around from town to town.
Yes, but I think, it was clear, it's clear in hindsight that it was a bit reactionary, because writing the memoir was so painful I really wanted to move as far away from my own life as I could. I lived in Ireland when I was in my early 20s and loved it. And I was always fascinated by this community, by the way that they interacted with the settled population. Ireland is a culture that is world renowned for its hospitality, for giving everyone a warm welcome. But there was a lot of animosity between settled Irish people and the traveling community. So I wanted to dig into that and understand where that came from. And so I worked on that for, it took me 5 years to write it. I had 2 babies in that time. It was a little busy, but I loved learning. I learned so much about that community while I was writing that book. And the other thing that I learned about writing fiction was that it doesn't matter how you dress up your characters. If you're doing it right, they're you. You can put them in, you can write about hobbits or stormtroopers or, witches or people from any background, any culture, any place. And this is the magic of fiction, is that we all inhabit the same humanity. Exactly. And if you can get at the heart of who these people are, they're very familiar no matter where they come from.
And the vulnerabilities and the insecurities.
Yes. Yeah, it was quite by accident that the main character in that novel, Christy, has so much of my own psychology, which I didn't, it was accidental, but it's become true of all my novels, I think.
Wow. And so Christopher and his family, they're gypsies. They roam from town to town, and then his father decides to settle down.
Yes, temporarily, but longer than usual. And they stay in one
town. He goes to school, he and his cousin.
Yes, so that he can get his first communion. And he's a few years late for it. But the father wants them to have that rite of passage, and so they stay in this town for a while so they can get their communion. And then Christy starts to sort of discover things about his identity that he's always questioned, but he's never really picked at before. And before you know it, he opens the whole Pandora's box of where he came from.
Okay, yeah, he carries the burden of guilt because his mother died. I'm not being a spoiler. This was on the synopsis.
Yes.
His mother died at childbirth. So.
Yes, yeah.
And you always have your secrets in your stories, and I love that.
Yeah, thank you.
Then you have The Crooked Branch, also written by you. I'm talking about all these books so that people know, because if I told you before, if they're listening to us, that means they speak English. So we're going to convince them to read them in English, or maybe convince some publisher to translate the books.
That would be great.
So The Crooked Branch.
Yes.
Magella and her daughter Emma.
Yes. So this one returns most closely to my own life. It's the story told in 2 separate timelines. The front story is Magella, who is a young mother in Queens, New York. And she's just had her first baby, and she's totally out of her depth. And she probably is struggling with some form of postpartum depression, though she doesn't call it that.
She just feels she's exhausted and feels isolated.
Yes, and she's not as happy as she expected to be in this blissful moment of new motherhood, which is sort of familiar to me. And so while she's grappling with that, she's also discovering things about her heritage and about her ancestry. So she finds a diary in the attic, and she starts to read about this ancestor of hers, Ginny, who was living in Ireland during the famine times, and what Ginny had to endure. And she sort of mistakes Ginny for a terrible mother, and then she determines that she's destined to be a terrible mother because this is in her DNA. It's in her line, all the terrible mothers that came before. Yeah. And then it's her journey of self-discovery and what she discovers about Ginny as well that sort of liberates her from the myth of bad motherhood.
It ends well, and also has a secret.
Yes.
From Ginny's past. Great. So, of course, most recently, American Dirt, Terra Americana. It's being adapted to a movie.
I think great. So, fantastic. Yeah, yes.
And also BBC Radio 4 book at bedtime. Mm-hmm. And an Oprah's book club pick. Wow. Yes. And you met her. I've seen your interview.
Yes.
Fantastic. That's
She's
a dream.
Wonderful. Yes. It was like, it's like winning the lottery for a writer.
And Anne Patchett, she's the author of The Dutch House, A Casa Holandesa, also has a translation. Among other awarded novels, she said, I'll never stop thinking about it. American Dirt. And I feel the same. I can't spoil, but I'm full of questions regarding the future of the characters. You know, they're still with me, really. And I loved it. And Stephen King said, I love when you have big authors praising the books. He said, it's an extraordinary work, a perfect act of balance with terror on one side and love on the other.
Yeah.
I couldn't have said it better. Wow. And, you know, I have to say, I neglected my own children. I have 3 boys. My youngest is very intense, very attention seeker.
Yes.
And he was like, Mother, so, I'm sorry, Mommy can't go right now. A whole weekend, I neglected my children to read your book.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry to your kids.
Yeah, that's your fault. Totally your fault. So Lydia, she's a woman like us. She's a bookshop owner. She's married. She has a 8-year-old, Luca. And then everything falls apart in an anniversary in a family party.
Yes, and on the first page. So again, no spoilers, but yes, they fall out of their very comfortable middle-class lives in an instant. Everything goes wrong. And just like that, they become migrants. And, you know, it takes Lydia quite some time to sort of come to terms with the reality that they are migrants. At the beginning, she almost thinks of it as being a disguise that they've put on to get to safety. And then at some point it hits her like, this is not pretend, this is who we are. And
they're survivors and they have to survive.
That's right. Yeah. And she will do, you know, this, it's funny given the reception of the book eventually, but at the time that I wrote it, it never occurred to me that it was a Mexican story or that it would be perceived as a Mexican story, because in fact
it was her nationality.
It's just right, but
she was a woman. She was me.
That's right. And it's unfortunately it's the story of our times. She could be anyone. She could be from Syria or Afghanistan or Ukraine or Paradise, California. And you know, we live in these most uncertain times when any one of us could find ourselves in Lydia's position. We all live in a place that could begin to collapse around us. It's a crazy world out there. Yeah. And so Lydia is the last person you would expect to find herself in that position, and yet there she is.
That's what I felt. It could be me exactly like that, because we never expect that. We're still safe in our shell and our safety shell that we think we have.
Right.
And like when she jumps to the running train, I would do that for my children.
Yes.
And you think you put yourself, I'm talking as a reader, of course, you put yourself in her shoes a lot of times.
Yes.
During the escape,
yes.
the
It makes
adventure.
me so happy to hear you say that, because I should say I have talked to well over 1,000 book clubs. I don't know how many book clubs, but so often when I'm speaking to readers, they say, "Oh, I could never do what Lydia did." And I always say, like, don't let yourself off the hook so easily, lady. You would if your child was at stake.
Yeah,
you would. If you had no other choice, you would.
You transform yourself. I remember I have a good temper at traffic, and we have bad traffic in Portugal, in Lisbon. And I once remember my first boy was a baby, and he was behind me in the car, and I was in the roundabout, so I have priority on the traffic. And then this bus came, huge, of course, it's a bus, and he came speeding like crazy because he was bigger than me, so he thought he was gonna outrun me, and I had the priority. I was going. It was my roundabout.
Yes.
And he scared me because he was going to crash my car, and in the window where my baby was sleeping. It was just as scary. It ended well. But I saw myself, and I make fun of myself. I threatened him with my hand on my neck. And I said, I would kill you. And I wanted him to read my lips. I would kill you.
Yes.
I would kill you.
Yes.
And I have good temper
yes.
in the traffic.
Yes.
I was furious. I was outside of myself, and I would kill him for my son if he would hurt my son. So of course, you would jump on a running to a running train.
Yes, you would find the strength to do whatever it takes. And for me, that's what the book is about. It is about the unbreakable bonds of love that exist between mothers, between parents and their children, and those are universal. Those cross every cultural boundary there is.
Of course. It's like you said about the characters. At the end of the day, we're all the same, and the love and the strength that we don't know exists. We all have it, and the vulnerabilities and the insecurities and the illusion of security.
Yes, the illusion of security. It's such a smart way of articulating that, because that, I think, is the sort of universal condition of this moment in the world, that some of us have the luxury of feeling very secure, but in fact, it's false. Yeah. It's still good to feel that way.
Yeah, thank God, and you're still grateful for that.
Yes, sure, but it could go. It could always go.
Yeah, so true. So, still in American dirt, Terra Americana, you started doing research for this book in 2013, reading everything you found and watching all the documentaries. You even went to the Mexican frontier, where you visited shelters and worked as a volunteer serving breakfasts. You were there.
Yes.
That's a great research work.
It was an amazing experience being in on the migrant trail and meeting people who had endured that journey, and there were so many humbling moments. It's funny because before I went to Mexico, I did all of this academic research that you mentioned, and I thought I did have quite a good foundation in what I expected to find when I got there. But it's like the difference between knowing something with your head and feeling it with your heart. When I went into those migrant shelters and I met the men and women who were making the journey, when I met the men and women who were running the shelters, who had devoted their lives to protecting vulnerable people, when I met the lawyers who were doing the pro bono legal work of protecting unaccompanied children, people doing humanitarian aid work, leaving water in the desert, documenting human rights abuses all along the migrant trail, there were so many humbling moments where I thought, at that point I had some, I would say, some heavy feelings of caution about writing the novel. I was a little worried.
It's delicate.
Yes, that I was a little worried that I had overstepped, or that I was telling us I was worried that I couldn't do justice to the suffering that people endure, right? Because I haven't experienced it myself, and I was thinking about that. And then I would have these experiences where I would meet people and be sort of confronted with my own cowardice. And I would recognize how absurd it is to be afraid to write a novel when you see what people actually endure to get to safety, to get their children to safety.
You gave them voice. I didn't know about them, or never thought about it, maybe selfishly, until I read your book. So that's you gave them voice. That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. So while there, when you're working a lot and researching for your books, are you able to read your readings? Yes and no. It's funny, when I am in the thickest part of the research, I find it difficult to read anything that's not related to the topic, because I become obsessed. So there could be 2 or 3 years when the only thing I was reading were contemporary Mexican and Central American writers who were writing around the topic of compulsory migration, or writing around the topic of the push factors that were causing the compulsory migration. I wasn't reading a lot of novels, which is where I generally live as a reader. So when I finally put the book to bed, or I have a draft that I feel is it's on its way, then I return to my first love, which is just devouring stories, And right now, actually, I am quite well into writing my new book. I'm about 350 pages in, maybe 2/3 of the way into writing it. So I have recently just returned to my life as a reader of novels. It's so good to be here. So nice. So before traveling through the books you chose, I saw one you posted on your Instagram account, and it caught my eye. And we have a translation for Portuguese. Ask Again, Yes, by Mary Beth Keane.
Yes.
We have it. It's called Direi Sempre Que Sim. It's translated. Yeah, I brought it for you to see it.
She's such a good writer.
No, I have to quote you because you were so funny. You know. First of all, when an author you admire praises a book, I get totally influenced by it. Like, now I'm your fan, I told you. When Jeanine arrived, she gave me a handshake and I said, I'm sorry, I have to kiss you and hug you. And you said you praised the book. And I'm going to quote
caption.
The caption.
Yes.
So you said, this book is so good, it will make you feel grateful you have eyeballs that can be used to read. And if moving, poignant page-turners aren't really your thing, then just think of it as a contribution to the college fund for Mary Beth Keen's two adorable boys. Even if you don't want to read it, buy it. do her a favor.
Yes. Well, she happens to be a friend of mine as well, but we met through our books, So I came to my love of her honestly through loving her books. And she happens to live quite near me, and we have children similar ages. They don't go to the same schools, but we have a lot in common, and so I have just fallen more and more in love with her novels. And she has a new one coming out this month.
Okay.
So
I started following her after your post.
Yes. And the new book is wonderful as well.
Great.
Hopefully it will be translated into Portuguese.
Okay. People have to buy this one.
Yeah.
Direi Sempre Que Sim. It's two ordinary families, one life-changing day. Two families that the women one wants to be the other's friend and she's not interested.
Yes. It's a great book.
Yeah.
It's what I love about her writing is that the characters are so complicated. There's no black and white. There's no good versus evil. Everyone has both, and they make decisions that you might not agree with, but you love them anyway, and somehow in my mind, she exists as this kind of writer that is so important right now because she provides the bridge that we don't have very often in our culture in the United States right now. We are such a polarized society. No one is translating between the two sides. No one is saying from the right, here is how the people on the left talk, and vice versa. Mary Beth Keen's characters inhabit both of those worlds, and they love each other. And so she's able to sort of show, I feel like she's giving us a blueprint on how we can come back together as a culture just by telling her stories,
Wow, what a great compliment. So Ask Again, Yes, Direi Sempre Que Sim. It's going to also, it was an instant New York Times bestseller, and it's also going to be a movie.
Yes.
Which is a great news. So who, besides you, another author, it's one of my favorites, she also complimented this book, Liane Moriarty.
Yes.
I love her. And another author that complimented this book as well was Louise Erdrich, who wrote a book you loved, and you brought it to this conversation, The Roundhouse.
Yes. She is an astonishing writer. There are very few living novelists who I think can hold a candle to her. She's, there is something just so deeply moving. It feels as though you're looking behind a very private curtain into the lives of her characters. And she's able to inhabit so many different points of view in a way that feels very coalescing. It's been many years since I read The Roundhouse, but funny enough, I am currently reading another old backlist book of hers, Love Medicine. And I'm reading that because I mentioned I'm, well into writing my new novel. And the structure of not to get all crafty on you, but
Go ahead.
The structure of the new novel is it spans 70 years in the life of one family. So it's 3 generations. And the action of the novel takes place from the 1950s through present day. So it's about a 70-year time span. And it's non-chronological, which is it's a mess, right?
It's going to give us a lot of work reading it.
Yeah, well, I hope not. I hope I'm going to do all the work writing it so that it will be easy to read. But I found myself tripping on the structure. I was having difficulty with it. So I went back and I decided to pick up every old novel I could think of that had a non-chronological decades-long time span, and I'm rereading those great books to try to figure out how did these authors do the magic acrobatics of skipping across all those decades back and forth,
yeah,
and bringing their readers with them so that they don't get lost or get mired down. And Louise Erdrich just does it beautifully in Love Medicine.
Love Medicine, great. And this is The Roundhouse. It's also translated.
Yes.
A Casa Redonda from Louise Erdrich. It's a woman living on a reservation in North Dakota. She's attacked.
Yes.
And then you have her husband and her teenage boy that want to help. And she closes. You want to tell us a bit?
Yeah.
Little?
Well, I will just say, like I said, it's been many years, so the finer points of the plot are lost on me at this stage, but I've never been more moved by a book. I think it's
beautiful and sad.
It's so sad. You know, I tend to love books that are sad. But also, they have to have this quality. They can't be just the kind of sad where I close the book and I'm like, well, now I'm depressed, you know? I don't want that. There has to be, if not some kind of redemption, at least something that I can learn, that I can fold into my heart, that has a little lightness to it. And there has to also be the quality of me wanting to turn the pages, you know? And Louise Erdrich always delivers on that, no matter what is going on in the books. And sometimes it's horrible. You just cannot wait to find out what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
And I just remember, I don't remember where I was, but I remember I was on a flight when I was reading The Roundhouse. And I was about 2 or 3 chapters from the end when my flight landed. And I went to my car and I didn't drive home. I sat in the car and I finished the novel and then I sobbed for about 20 minutes before I drove home. And then I was like a blubbering mess, you know, and I was traveling alone. So I must have been traveling for work. And I remember coming home to my husband and my 2 daughters, and they were like, what is wrong with you? And I was like, it's Louise Erdrich's fault.
And once again, we are safe, even if it's an illusion.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, but such a beautiful novel, so incredibly moving. And I think she manages that universal language of like making you feel as though you are experiencing what the characters are experiencing, you know, and learning from it.
And again, they're different from a different scenario, different culture. They're from a tribe. Yeah. I also read it a long time ago, and I loved it. It was published in 2012, and it got the National Book Award winning author.
Yes.
It was great.
And she deserved it.
Yeah, and it was, many people considered it one of the best novels of the year.
Absolutely. Maybe one of the best novels of the decade.
Wow.
Yeah.
And years after, you still have it on your top 10 list?
Yes.
Of course. Top 4. The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich, A Casa Redonda. It's the name in Portuguese.
Yes.
The last book you chose for this conversation, and I love what you said, from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and you said, Love in Time of Cholera, not 100 Years of Solitude. Is his great novel, O Amor nos Tempos de Cólera, also translated.
Yes. Well, I should say 100 Years of Solitude is one of the greatest books ever written, but everyone thinks it's his masterwork, and I would argue that Love in the Time of Cholera is better. It's even better than 100 Years of Solitude. He's just, again, a magical writer. He's the kind of writer that makes you... He's a writer's writer, because you read him and you see what's possible to cast a spell as a writer. You know, how the rules don't apply to him.
He makes it look easy.
Yes. Yes. His characters can do anything. Nature bends to his will. You know, he is just such a... And it makes sense. You never question it. As the reader, you think, well, of course those butterflies are following her around. Like, why wouldn't they? You know, he's just a magical talent. So I loved all of his books, but Love in the Time of Cholera, there's something about that lifelong, unrequited love. I won't give it away, but... the yearning
Yeah, but you can explain it. He waited for her 50 years.
50 years. Have you ever heard anything more romantic than that? And then he fumbles it. He like shows up at the funeral of her husband and is like, hey, can we be together now? And she's like, what is wrong with you? But, you know, he never gives up on her. He's like such a mess, that guy, but he loves her. And she's... The two of them, I think, two of the most memorable characters in all of literature.
Florentino Ariza.
Yes.
And her name is Fermina Daza.
Yes. Yes.
And she marries Juvenal Urbino, and he waits for... And
he waits for 50 years.
Yeah, and I love it. It's 51 years, 9 months, and 4 days.
Yes.
But who's counting?
Oh, love it.
Love in Time of Cholera. Gabriel Garcia Marquez. O amor nos tempos de cólera. The other book you chose, you read it recently,
yes.
Bonos Memoir.
Yes. You know, it's funny. I just recently said to someone, sometimes when people ask me who my literary influences are, I lie and I say Gabriel Garcia Marquez instead of Bono.
Tell us the truth.
You know, and then I said, well, it's true that I am, I think, hugely influenced by Marquez, but I'm also hugely influenced by Bono, and more so, I think, because I was a kid who grew up in the 80s. I came from a family, I didn't know anyone who made a living as a writer or an artist of any kind, and seeing someone who grew up the same way that I grew up have the audacity to use language, like everyday language, not elevated language, not academic language, but to use regular words in unexpected ways to provoke such an enormous feeling from people so effectively. You know, he showed me, I think, a blueprint for how someone like me could find success using language as my way in the world. And I've always loved you too. I feel like he's a poet first. And then there's also something, he's incredibly, I think, on stage, but also in the memoir, and just in general, in the way he moves through the world. I think Bono is a person who strikes me as incredibly earnest and authentic. Yeah. And he somehow still manages to be cool, even though he's like super vulnerable all the time.
Sweet.
And I know, he's like kind of dorky, you know? but really smart and really moving. And the memoir is just... it's incredible. He talks a lot about things that are very unfashionable, like his faith, in ways that are undeniably moving. And he's just one of a kind. You know, he owns it. He doesn't make excuses for who he is. He's very open about, like, this is who I am, this is how I feel.
No filter.
Yes. And I find that sometimes when I am allowing someone to see that more vulnerable part of me, I always feel, I find myself justifying it or explaining myself, like, well, I think this, but here's why, you know. And Bono, like, he skips that part.
He doesn't care.
He's just like, this is who I am, take it or leave it, you know. And I really admire that. Yeah, and I attribute the tremendous success of him as an individual, and in part the band U2, to that very quality that he has, that vulnerability,
his personality.
Yes,
the man he is.
Yes, and also I think the man that the other three band members equally are. He's the most knowable of the four, because he allows himself to be known. But they're all remarkable people. I think all four of them are remarkable talents. They are smart.
And they deserve the success they have.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, and they use it for good. You know, they use it to do good things in the world. So I take my hat off to them.
Great way of saying it. So Bonos Memoir, Surrender. It's also in Portuguese, which is great. All your books you chose.
Good.
Translator. Surrender, 40 canções, uma história. So at the end of our conversation, which I'm loving and I would stay here forever, I give you a book considering your taste, what you prefer. This time I did something original. There's this English author that I love, and she has 2 podcasts, which I love to hear. Her name is Elizabeth Day. She has a podcast named How to Fail, where she interviews people that succeeded, but before they have failed. So like Maggie O'Farrell, other authors, and not only authors, sports people who lost their child. It's on air from a couple of years now.
Yes.
How to Fail. And then she has this more recent one, in which I heard all. It's called Best Friend Therapy. She has a best friend, which is a therapist.
Oh. And
she says the motto is 2 best friends, 1 therapist, no filter.
Oh, I love it.
And each conversation is a theme. Okay. So like boundaries, people pleasing, winning, online dating. They talk about everything. Elizabeth, she opens her heart and talks a lot about herself. Mm-hmm. And Emma is more recoiled, more.
Yes.
She's a therapist.
Yes.
So she mentioned American Dirt.
Oh.
Yeah, your book on the How to Fail podcast. And so I read her book, The Party. I haven't read this one yet, but it just arrived in Portugal. So I thought, once she's your fan, I'm going to give you her book, her latest book, called Magpie. It's a thriller.
Oh, wonderful.
And it's translated in Portuguese called A Impostora. It just arrived in Portugal, Elizabeth Day.
I can't wait to read it.
Oh, that's great. It's a psychological thriller, impossible to put down.
Yes.
They said on a Daily Mail. I thought you would like it.
Yes.
So when Marisa meets Jake, everything falls into place. But then their new lodger, Kate, arrives, and something isn't right about her. Or is it just Marisa's head? So
dun, dun, dun.
Exactly. And I love those, what's in the cover.
I love that.
She has almost everything. The rest she'll take.
I love it. It's right up my alley. Perfect.
Cool.
Thank you. Yeah.
I hope you like it. She's your fan, so maybe you'll be her fan too.
That's great. I've heard of the podcast, the first one.
How to Fail.
How to Fail. I haven't listened to it, but now I will.
Great.
Yeah.
And Best Friend Therapy I also advise. It's
great.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Me too. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
So nice to meet you. That was great. Thank you.